He was the personification of the evil dictator. Clad in his familiar khaki uniform and cap and chomping on a cigar, he ruled with an iron fist over his island nation. He took on the United States and brought the world to the brink of nuclear holocaust. Shifting his attention to his own country, he decimated the economy, creating a communistic dictatorship that forced the people to revere him even as he ruined their lives. In this episode of Biographics, we take a closer look at the life of Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was born on August 13, 1926 in the small farming village of Manacas in northern Oriente in Cuba. His father, Angel Castro Yegas, had immigrated from Spain in 1898 and picked up work as a bricklayer and railroad worker before starting his own business selling lemonade to field workers. From this humble start, he built a small sugarcane empire comprising 26,000 acres and 300 worker families. Angel's first wife, Maria Agitator, gave birth to 2 children and then either died or simply walked out on the family. Angel soon took up with his young maid, Lina Ruz Gonzalez, who bore him 3 children, and Ramon and Fidel. The couple were married shortly after Fidel's birth. They were a relatively wealthy family who lived in a Galician-style 2-story house in the country. Still, they did live a decidedly country lifestyle, with chickens and pigs wandering through the house. Fidel was named after a local politician, with his name meaning faithful. He did have his father's temperament, which meant he was prone to violent outbursts. His sister recalls that if he was playing baseball and his team were losing, he would simply gather up the equipment and walk off the field. Close friends and future novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez recalled that Fidel was the worst loser that he had ever met. When he reached school age, Fidel was sent to study in Santiago, the second largest city in Cuba. For the first 2 years, he stayed with his godparents and was homeschooled by them. After that, he was enrolled at the Maris LaSalle School along with brothers Ramon and Raul. Fidel soon gained a reputation as a troublemaker and a bit of a bully. When he was in the 4th grade, Fidel's father received a letter stating that his 3 boys were the biggest bullies in the entire school. Angel was furious and pulled the boys out of the school. This enraged Fidel, who threatened to burn the house down. He ended up being sent to a more demanding Jesuit school in Havana, with his father threatening to cut off his allowance if his grades dropped below a certain level. Fidel responded to this by forging his school reports. Castro proved to be a decidedly average student, but there was one area in which he excelled. He had a photographic memory, a fact which hugely impressed his fellow students. They would call him to a page number from their textbooks and he would recite the page word for word. In his teens, Fidel began to develop his ability as a public speaker and as a debater. After an initial rejection, he gained acceptance into the Alavanada Literary Academy, which was the literary wing at the Jesuit school. At first, he was paralyzed by stage fright, but he gradually became more relaxed and more confident in his presentations. In October of 1945, Fidel entered law school at the University of Havana. At the time, the university was a self-governing body which forbade the police or army from setting foot on campus. As a result, it was a hotbed of clandestine activity by gangsters and political agitators. It was a very attractive environment for the hot-headed Castro. Fidel's first foray into political agitation was precipitated by a rise in bus fares that had been authorized by Cuban President Ramon Grau. Castro organized a protest against the fare rise and led a march to the presidential palace. The police beat the students, with Fidel himself receiving slight injuries. He used this incident to his advantage by going to the press and receiving some sympathetic coverage. At the time that Castro enrolled at the university, there were 2 main gangster groups who were vying for control: the Socialist Revolutionary Movement, MSR, and the Insurrectional Revolutionary Union, UIR. There were frequent violent clashes between these 2 groups. Fidel quickly sized up the situation and began to maneuver between the 2 groups. In December of 1946, there was an assassination attempt on a leading member of the UIR, and Castro was fingered as the triggerman. His assumed motive here was that he wanted to ingratiate himself with the MSR leadership. As it turned out, it was the leader of UIR, Emilio Troy, who took Castro under his wing. He gave Fidel a pistol, which the young budding revolutionary revolutionary carried with him at all times. Tro had been planning an invasion of the Dominican Republic in conjunction with a group of Dominican exiles in response to the terrible conditions brought about by the rule of Rafael Trujillo. Castro quickly jumped on board and sailed with about 12,000 fellow revolutionaries to Cayo Confites on July 29, 1947. For 2 months, they underwent paramilitary training before setting off for the Dominican mainland. Meanwhile, Trujillo had learned of the planned attack and had even appealed to the United States for aid. The revolutionary leaders got cold feet and called off the invasion, and the embarrassed Cuban army began rounding up the ships and taking the would-be attackers into custody. Castro managed to evade custody by jumping ship and swimming 8 miles to the shore. In 1947, Castro visited a new model prison on the Isle of Pines as part of his legal studies. When he returned to Havana, he criticized the prison and its inhumane treatment of its inhabitants. The following year, he was part of a student congress that traveled to Bogota, Colombia. On April 7th, the group met with the leader of the Liberal Party, Jorge Gayton, who looked likely to win the upcoming election. 2 days later, though, Gayton was shot dead. Bogota erupted in violence, and the students from Cuba were caught in the middle of it. Castro became actively involved, participating in the takeover of a police station. After 3 days, the authorities restored order, but not before some 3,500 people had been killed. Castro returned to Havana, where he became a follower of Senator Eddie Hibas, the main opponent of President Grau. Hibas was the founder of the Cuban People's Party. Castro campaigned hard for Hibas in his unsuccessful bid for the presidency in 1948. Still, the two men were never close. Hibas saw Fidel as somewhat of an embarrassment due to his gangster background, and Fidel only ever viewed the leader as an obstacle to his own path to power. In order to gain political respectability, Castro cut off his association with his gangster associates. He gave speeches on campus denouncing the two main gangs and naming names of those who were responsible for criminal activity. This made him a target for both groups, and he was forced into hiding. Around this time, Fidel, who was generally awkward and shy around women, met Mirta Diaz-Balart, the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in Cuba. The couple fell in love and were married in 1948, with Mirta's father getting them $10,000 for a 3-month honeymoon in the United States. Most of their time was spent in New York, where Fidel learned some English. Returning to Cuba, the newlyweds moved into a hotel across the street from a military camp in Havana. In September of 1949, Mirta gave birth to a son who would become known as Fidelito. Having graduated from university, Fidel began a small law practice. Most of his time, however, was spent dabbling in politics. On August 15, 1951, People's Party leader Eddie Hibas was giving his usual Sunday radio address, urging the people to stop accepting the corruption of the government and take action. He then pulled out a pistol and shot himself in the stomach. The dramatic act was intended to rouse the people, but Hibas had spoken for too long, and his suicide attempt was not broadcast. For the next 11 days, Hibas lay in a hospital bed in terrible agony. At his side the entire time was Fidel Castro. When the leader died, Castro was prominent as part of the honor guard that stood outside the University Hall of Honor, where Hibas lay in state. As the military escort prepared to lead the body through the streets in a large procession, Castro entreated the captain to divert the route to the presidential palace. Fidel was convinced that he could rouse the people to overthrow the government. But the army captain refused, fearing that an absolute bloodbath would ensue. The following year, Castro ran for a seat on the Chamber of Deputies. He managed to garner the support of the majority of the People's Party members and looked in line to win the upcoming election. However, on March 10th, former President Fulgencio Batista staged a military coup and seized power. He began rounding up his political adversaries, including members of the People's Party. Fidel and his brother Raul went into hiding. The Batista coup diverted Castro from what could have been a promising diplomatic career in favor of becoming a fully fledged revolutionary. He gathered together his own political group, drawn from former party members and followers from his university days. Traveling up and down the country, he put his oratorical and propaganda skills to full effect. After 14 months, he had a following of 12,000 people. Castro ran his organization with military precision and discipline. Drinking alcohol was forbidden, and he imposed strict sexual standards. He also organized his forces at a cellular level, with members of each cell being unaware of the existence of other cells. By the middle of 1953, Castro had the support base that he needed to stage his own coup. What he didn't have, though, were weapons, or indeed the money to buy them. His solution was to attack a military base and seize its weapons. The base selected was located at Moncado. The attack, however, was bungled from the start. One of the 26 vehicles en route to the base had a flat tire, another took a wrong turn and did not arrive until the attack was well underway. When the remainder of the vehicles arrived at the base, they were surprised to find it heavily fortified. The military defenders soon beat back the invaders, with 8 of Castro's men being killed. The remainder fled, but over the next few days, many of them were rounded up by the authorities. 69 of them were eventually tortured and put to death. Castro himself was put on trial before a military tribunal. He used the opportunity to speak out about the regime of Batista and the harsh treatment of his fellow revolutionaries. His courtroom defense statement of "history will absolve me" would become probably his most famous speech. Still, he was convicted and sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. Castro and his followers were sent to the previously mentioned Isle of Pines prison. Fidel used his time there to instill a supreme level of order and discipline in his men. The Castro rebels gained a reputation for their good behavior and were given great freedom. Then, on March 6, 1954, bowing to public pressure, President Batista granted amnesty to Castro and his men. The show of good faith from the president, however, did not stop Castro from speaking out about the regime. When 2 of his men were beaten by Batista enforcers, Fidel became increasingly concerned for his own safety. He would move houses every 2 to 3 days, and then, just 2 months after being released from prison, he left Cuba for Mexico. It was Castro's plan to build up and train a new wing of his revolutionary army in Mexico and then return to join forces with those already in Havana in a huge push to oust the Batista regime. His Mexican army began as a group of about 60 Cuban defectors who lived in 6 small houses under strict disciplinary conditions imposed by Fidel. It was during this period that Castro met Ernesto Che Guevara, who would play a key role in the coming revolution. Castro launched his revolution in late November 1956 from the port of Tuxpan on the Mexican coast. It was planned to coincide with another uprising organized by a rival anti-Batista group. Fidel had bought a 60-foot boat that was designed to take a maximum of 25 passengers, and he piled 82 of his men on board. As it chugged its way towards Cuba, the boat was in constant danger of capsizing. The journey was so slow that the planned 5-day trip took 7 days, meaning that they would miss the uprising of the other group. The boat beached at a place called Purgatory Point on December 2nd. But by now, Batista's army, who had already put down the first rebellion, had learned that Castro was on his way and that he had planes overhead ready to strafe the invaders and bomb the area. Only about a dozen men survived, Castro and Guevara among them. They began a 3-day march through the forest, constantly being hounded from the air by the Cuban Air Force. They finally reached the Sierra Maestra region, where they settled with the local villagers and began to regroup. 6 weeks later, Castro led 33 men on a guerrilla raid on a tiny army garrison in La Plata. 2 soldiers were killed, and the rebels stole off with a number of weapons. A month after this attack, Castro decided it was time to get his propaganda machine in motion. He sent one of his men to Havana to bring a foreign journalist back to the camp. The man chosen was from the New York Times, and soon a 3-part story had appeared in the paper describing the massive military buildup that Castro was organizing in the south of Cuba. Castro's support base grew exponentially, with more and more disaffected Cubans joining his ranks. In March of 1958, younger brother Raul began to establish a second force out of Oriente, which soon grew in number. Raul proved to be a highly capable military commander, with his force capturing and destroying many planes, tanks, and military vehicles. In April, Fidel called upon the people of Cuba to stage a nationwide strike. He believed that this would be the start of his long-planned uprising. President Batista responded by threatening to shoot anyone who participated in the strike. As a result, more than 140 people were shot down in the street. But this action only fueled Castro's support base, and even more people streamed to support him. With the tide now decidedly turned in his favor, Castro decided to move. He sent Che Guevara and another of his commanders, Camilo Cienfuegos, on a westward march towards Havana, along with their rebel forces. The government forces put up virtually no resistance, and the rebels were able to take control, one town after another. On December 31st, 1958, with Castro's men closing in, Batista resigned and fled the country. 3 days later, Castro arrived in Santiago to a hero's welcome. He gave a speech in front of 200,000 people. Hours later, Guevara and Cienfuegos marched into Havana and seized control of the reins of power. And just like that, the Castro era had begun. The transfer of power was amazingly orderly. Castro had warned his men against looting or destroying property. He had come to power on the backs of an army of poor and illiterate peasants. Now that he had gained power, he would need to educate men to help him govern. He chose to appoint his former professor, José Miro Cardona, as prime minister and Manuel Urrutia to be president. He made himself supreme commander of the armed forces. Behind the scenes, however, Castro put the organization in place to ensure that he was the holder of overall power. In the weeks following the revolution, more than 500 Batista officials were tried, convicted, and put to death. That number would rise to 1,900 over the coming year. Within 7 months of seizing power, Castro decided that he no longer had any need for a puppet government. On July the 16th, he announced that he was resigning his position as army commander because he could no longer work with President Urrutia, who had accused him of corruption. Castro then disappeared for a number of days. Just as Fidel had intended, the people rose up in protest and demanded that the president must go. The frightened president sought sanctuary in the Venezuelan embassy before escaping the country. This allowed Castro to return in triumph and appoint himself as president. Castro now imposed totalitarian rule. Those who did not give him their absolute support were in danger of being seized and put on trial, or just simply shot. Within a few short months, all signs of resistance within Cuba, including critical media, had simply been removed. Now Castro fixed his attention on securing external security. A focus was put on increasing the size and the strength of his army. 6 months after seizing power, Castro visited the United States, where he was greeted with enthusiasm by the media, as well as politicians and the public. Behind the scenes, however, the Eisenhower government was already making plans for Castro's removal. In February of 1960, the Cuban leader signed an agreement with the Russians by which Cuban sugar would be traded for military arms and oil. This was at the height of the Cold War, and many of the oil refineries in Cuba were American-owned. When the owners refused to process Soviet oil imports, Castro seized their businesses. The US government responded by cutting 700,000 tons from the US annual purchase commitment. In turn, Castro nationalized US-owned agriculture and industrial businesses. Castro's move had a huge impact on the US mafia, which lost about $100 million worth of property in the tourist industry alone. During this period of nationalization, more than 200,000 professional and upper-class citizens fled the country. Relations between the United States and Cuban governments became so strained that in March of 1960, President Eisenhower greenlit the training of a group of Cuban exiles to stage an invasion and seek control. The ball was picked up by President Kennedy, resulting in the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. Castro had gotten wind of the invasion and had his forces ready and waiting. With their lack of promised US air support, the Cuban rebels were cut to pieces. On December 1st, 1961, Castro went on national television and declared that he was a Marxist-Leninist and would be until the day he died. The Soviets took a wary view of their newly declared communist fellow, but the Americans responded immediately, imposing a total economic blockade on Cuba. This led to economic disaster, with massive food shortages resulting. Finally, the Soviet government decided to embrace Castro. They offered to station Soviet missiles on the island. In mid-October 1962, the American government got concrete evidence of the missile operation, leading to what became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy placed a total military blockade around Cuba and announced that a military attack from Cuba on any nation would be seen as a direct attack by the Soviet Union on the United States. Castro urged the Russians to make a preemptive strike on the United States if the Americans attacked the island. After 13 days, during which the world was a hair trigger away from nuclear destruction, the Russians backed down and agreed to remove the missiles. Castro was left completely out of the negotiation process, and he was not happy. Soviet President Nikita Khrushchev tried to placate him by inviting Castro on a 40-day trip through the Soviet Union. During the trip, Khrushchev offered to provide economic aid to the struggling island. In 1965, the United States announced that it was willing to take in Cuban refugees. This led to a mass exodus, with a resultant huge loss of skills and manpower on the island. With the international situation having settled, Castro set his focus on making agricultural reforms to improve the economy. He wanted to increase the sugar harvest and set a target for national production in 1965 of 5.5 million tons, increasing to 10 million tons by 1970. These expectations, however, they were totally unreasonable. Still, he poured nearly all of the country's economic resources into the sugarcane industry, leaving all other economic activity barren. The whole country, including the elderly, young children, and military workers, were put to work in the fields in a desperate quest to reach his targets. Even Castro himself was said to have cut cane for 4 hours every day. As the rest of the Cuban economy fell by 20 and 40%, the sugarcane project failed dismally to reach its projected targets. In 1970, Castro announced that the plan had failed. Typical of his flair for the dramatic, he resigned his presidency. The people demanded that he return, though, and soon he was back in power, and the sugarcane crisis was behind him. Throughout the 1970s, Castro began looking for ways to extend his influence abroad. He began involving himself in revolutionary movements and sending forces to train and lead various guerrilla operations. His support of civil wars in Angola and Somalia ate up more of his country's limited resources. During the early 1980s, sugar prices and production had increased significantly. This allowed the Cuban economy to grow at a rate of 24%. But when the sugar price slumped dramatically, Cuba's international debt ballooned to $6 billion. At the same time, it still owed $19 billion to the Soviet Union. The Soviets tried to help by increasing trade, but with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, all the agreements fell apart. The already weak Cuban economy was severely restricted. Strict rationing was put in place, the electricity supply became sporadic, and tractors were replaced with ox-drawn carts. With his country on the brink of collapse, in 1993, Castro allowed Cubans to start private businesses. The following year, he permitted foreign investors to own Cuban businesses as well. The economy, which had declined by 40% in the past 3 years, finally began to grow. By the 1990s, Castro was an aging, isolated, and largely depressed dictator. The majority of his close associates were either dead or had been exiled. He still kept up his habit of staying in one place for only 2 or 3 nights, so he was constantly being moved around in a bulletproof Mercedes limousine. During this period, Castro's tight grip on the country seemed to loosen slightly. But then, in March of 2003, he imposed a crackdown which saw scores of journalists, students, and professional people arrested as dissidents of the regime. In July of 2006, the 80-year-old Castro underwent surgery for internal bleeding. The following year, he handed over the presidential reins to his brother, Raul. From then, Fidel's health gradually deteriorated. The end finally came on November 26, 2016, though the exact cause of his death was never released. The country was in mourning for 9 days. So I really hope you enjoyed that episode of Biographics. If you did, there's a couple of things you could do right now. One is hit that like button below. Also, if you want more stuff like this, we put out brand new videos every Monday and every Thursday. So hit that subscribe button below. And subscribe button doesn't do what it used to on YouTube. If you actually want to get a notification about these videos, please do hit that bell button next to the subscribe button, and that'll send you a notification every time, every Monday and Thursday when we put out a new video. Also, if you want to watch something else right now, stuff from the archive, over there on the right. And as always, thank you for watching.